At my brother's wedding, one of his friends joked that marriage might finally stop Evan from supporting me. I said quietly, "Those payments were never support." Camille turned toward him. Evan's face changed. Seconds later, he grabbed the microphone, pointed at me, and said, "I wish you'd never been my sister. You're a disgrace and a burden. You don't belong here." His friends laughed. I looked down at the wedding gift beneath my chair, stood slowly, and said, "Fine, then let's see something special. Stay with me, because what happened after that changed everything I believed about my brother. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and keep listening." 3 hours earlier, I had stood outside the reception hall with a rectangular box pressed against my ribs, smoothing the silver ribbon for the third time, even though there was nothing wrong with it. May sunlight flashed off the windows of the venue, and through the glass doors I could already see white flowers, champagne flutes, and people moving beneath strings of warm lights. The box was heavier than it looked. I had spent 6 months making what was inside, working on it in the evenings after I came home from the library, sorting photographs at my kitchen table until my eyes blurred. I had imagined giving it to Evan and Camille quietly after the reception, something private and ordinary between family. I had never imagined it would become the most dangerous object in the room. Evan had invited me, but from the moment I entered, I understood that being invited and being included were not the same thing. My place card was at a table near the edge of the room with several coworkers of Camille's mother and 2 couples I had never met. The small table closest to the newlyweds held Camille's parents, an aunt and uncle, Evan's best man, and people from the wedding party. There was no empty chair waiting for the groom's only sister. Even the printed program simply listed me among the guests as Laura Bennett. Nothing identified me as family. I noticed it. Then I did what I had spent years learning to do where Evan was concerned. I found an explanation that hurt less. Weddings were complicated. Seating charts were political puzzles. Camille had a large extended family. Evan had friends who had helped organize the day. I was 42 years old. I did not need a chair beside my brother to know who I was to him. At least that was what I told myself. When Evan finally crossed the room toward me, his hug lasted barely long enough for his hand to touch my shoulder blade. He looked immaculate in his dark suit, more polished than the boy I still sometimes pictured, with grass stains on his knees and a backpack almost as big as his torso. Someone called his name before I could say much, and he turned immediately, already smiling for the next person. I watched him disappear into a circle of friends and felt the familiar urge to excuse him. It was his wedding. Everyone wanted something from him today. I had been doing that for 19 years, making room around whatever Evan needed. Later, I understood why he had invited me. Leaving his only sister off the guest list would have raised questions from Camille and Margaret, and Evan had every reason to believe I was safe. For years I had let him reduce our past to a sentence without correcting him, changing the subject whenever old hardships threatened to expose how much help he had once needed. He had mistaken that silence for permission. The first warning arrived so casually that I almost missed it. A man from Evan's friend group stopped beside my table while looking for his seat. He recognized my name from the card and smiled with the easy familiarity of someone who already knew something about me. He made a remark about Evan finally getting one weekend without a family emergency. The words were light enough to pass as a joke. I gave him a puzzled smile, but he had already moved on. 20 minutes later, another friend mentioned how generous Evan was with family, particularly considering everything he had on his shoulders. She said it admiringly, the way people praise someone for quietly taking care of a difficult relative. I felt the first cold thread work its way beneath my dress. Neither of these people knew me. Yet somehow, they knew a story about me. Across the room, Evan was laughing beside Camille. She looked beautiful, relaxed, one hand resting lightly against his arm while a photographer moved around them. Her mother, Margaret, passed my table soon afterward. She stopped long enough to thank me for coming and asked whether I was comfortable. There was nothing openly rude about her. If anything, her manners were almost perfect. But there was a carefulness in the way she studied me. The restrained kindness people use around someone they have already been warned may become difficult. I began noticing things I had previously dismissed. Evan had stopped inviting me to gatherings with his newer friends. When colleagues were involved, he usually suggested we meet separately. In photographs from the last few years, I seemed to exist on birthdays and occasional holidays, but nowhere near the life he displayed professionally. Until that afternoon, I had told myself siblings simply drifted as adults. Now I wondered whether Evan had been moving away from me or moving me somewhere specific in the story he told everyone else. I kept the thought to myself. That was still my instinct. Dinner passed beneath the scrape of silverware and soft music. The box remained beneath my chair, one corner touching the side of my shoe. Every few minutes I felt it there and remembered why I had come. Not for the seating chart. Not for his friends. Not even because Evan had been especially warm to me lately. I had come because he was my brother, and some part of me still saw the 12-year-old who used to leave his bedroom door open at night because silence frightened him after our mother got sick. The speeches began as dusk settled beyond the windows. Nolan, Evan's best man, was funny without being cruel at first. He told a few stories from their 20s, carefully chosen stories about terrible apartments, ambitious plans, and Evan working harder than everyone around him. I could see the version of my brother that these people admired, disciplined, self-made, always moving forward. Then one of the men near Nolan called out something about marriage, finally giving Evan an excuse to stop funding family emergencies. A few people laughed. Another voice added that maybe his sister could finally stand on her own now. The remark was tossed across the table as if I were not sitting 15 feet away. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. For years I had absorbed smaller things for Evan because correcting them seemed petty. This one was different. It involved money. Specific money. Money he knew the truth about. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand. Those payments were never support. Camille heard me. Her head turned first toward me, then toward her husband. That movement changed Evan more quickly than my words had. His smile stayed in place, but the skin around it tightened. He looked from Camille to me, and then toward the cluster of friends who had spent years hearing his version. I saw calculation pass over his face, not careful calculation, but the frantic kind that happens when someone feels a door opening behind them and reaches for the nearest thing that might slam it shut. He stepped toward the microphone. At first I thought he was going to make another joke and move on. That would have been the sensible thing. Instead, he glanced toward his friends, saw the familiar smiles waiting for him, and seemed to decide that the room already belonged to his story. He said my name. Conversation thinned around us. Then he pointed at me. I wish you'd never been my sister. You're a disgrace and a burden. You don't belong here. The first laugh came from somewhere near Nolan's table. Then another. Brief, uncertain, almost reflexive. I barely heard them. Burden. The word pulled me out of that decorated room for half a second and dropped me into a much smaller one 19 years earlier. My mother's hand had been thin against the blanket. Her voice had been weaker every day, but the fear in it had remained sharp. She had worried about what would happen to Evan. She had worried even more about what caring for him would do to me. I remembered the promise I made. He would never grow up believing he was my burden. Back in the reception hall, I looked at the man he had become. Camille was no longer smiling. Margaret had gone completely still. Nolan's face had changed as though the laugh had died before he knew what to do with it. My chest felt hollow, but my hands were steady. For one last second, I considered walking away. I could collect my purse, leave through the side doors, drive home, and let Evan keep whatever version of me he had sold them. That was what I had always done in smaller ways. Protect the boy, absorb the discomfort, refuse to keep score. Then the toe of my shoe touched the box beneath my chair. I looked down at the silver ribbon. 6 months of photographs, birthdays, school ceremonies, ordinary pieces of a life Evan apparently believed no one else would ever see clearly. I bent, lifted the gift into my hands, and stood. Evan's confidence vanished the instant he recognized the box. I looked directly at him. Fine, then let's see something special. and for the first time that day, my brother looked afraid of a gift I had made with love. For several seconds after I set the box in front of Camille, nobody moved. The music had faded into something I could barely hear beneath the blood beating in my ears. Evan stood near the microphone with one hand still wrapped around it, but the certainty that had carried him through those words was gone. He was staring at the silver ribbon as though I had placed something dangerous on the table. That reaction hurt almost as much as what he had said. He knew exactly what the box was because I had mentioned the gift months earlier. I had told him I was putting together something from our family, something Camille might like to have now that she was becoming part of it. He had never asked what photographs I was using or what memories I had found. At the time, I had assumed he wanted to be surprised. Now I understood that surprise was not what frightened him. Camille pulled the ribbon loose. Evan stepped closer, telling her there was no reason to turn the reception into whatever drama I was trying to create. He spoke quickly, keeping his voice lower now that Margaret and several people near the wedding table were listening. I watched the same instinct take hold again, define my intentions before anyone could see what I had actually done. Camille opened the lid anyway. The album inside was bound in dark blue cloth, plain except for a small card I had tucked beneath the cover. I had written both their names on it weeks before the wedding. There was no accusation, no calculation, nothing that belonged in a revenge plan. It was a wedding gift made by a woman who had still believed family history was something worth giving to the next person joining it. Camille turned the first page. The photograph there showed Evan at 13, standing in our apartment kitchen with a birthday cake that leaned noticeably to one side because the oven in that place never heated evenly. He was thin, all elbows and knees, with braces that made him reluctant to smile. In the picture, I was behind him holding a knife over the cake while he tried to block the camera with one hand. The next pages were just as ordinary. A school awards night, a cheap plastic Christmas tree squeezed beside a radiator, Evan asleep in the passenger seat after an entrance exam, his forehead against the window. The paper bus passed from that trip, flattened beneath a clear sleeve, because for some reason I had saved it. A photograph of him wearing a borrowed jacket at his high school graduation, one of us standing outside his college dorm while boxes towered behind us on the sidewalk. I had chosen those things because they were ours, not because they proved anything. That difference seemed to make Evan more uncomfortable. He tried to dismiss the album before Camille had reached the middle. He said I had always been sentimental about the years after our mother died, always making ordinary family responsibilities sound larger than they were. Then he shifted slightly and suggested I had a habit of turning every milestone in his life into a reminder of what I had once done for him. He did not deny a single photograph or say the memories were false. He only tried to control what they meant, and I watched Camille notice the difference. Her fingers slowed as she turned another page. People nearby were beginning to look away, the way decent people do when they suddenly realize they have been standing too close to someone else's humiliation. A few of Evan's friends had lost the loose, amused posture they had carried through the speeches. Nolan remained near the edge of the wedding party, his champagne glass untouched in his hand. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I wanted the floor beneath me to open. There are moments when being proven right gives no satisfaction because the truth itself is too painful. Every page Camille turned reminded me that I had assembled that book while imagining Evan laughing at the old photographs beside his wife. I had spent evenings deciding whether Camille would appreciate the picture of him asleep under a library table at 14, or whether that would embarrass him. I had removed photographs I thought were too private. I had protected him even inside the gift. Now he was looking at it as if I had built a weapon. Near the back, Camille stopped. The page held a photograph from Evan's college graduation. He was 22, taller than me by then, wearing his cap crooked because he had always hated the way graduation caps looked. His arm was around my shoulders. I remembered the heat that day, the crowd spilling across campus, the way he had kept checking that I was still beside him whenever people pulled him away for pictures. Under the photograph was a folded piece of paper. I had almost left it out of the album. Evan had written it that night on a card from the hotel desk because he had forgotten to buy me anything. The handwriting was unmistakably his, quick, slanted, impatient. Camille opened it. There were several lines, but only one mattered. Everything I become after today started with you. The room changed without anyone announcing it. Nolan lowered his eyes. Margaret's attention shifted completely to Evan. Even the people who knew nothing about our childhood could understand what that sentence meant. It had not been written by a resentful sister trying to claim credit. It had been written by Evan himself, years before Camille, before the wedding, before the people now surrounding him had entered his life. Evan's jaw tightened. He said the note had been emotional gratitude after graduation, nothing more. He insisted that loving someone when you were young did not mean they owned the rest of your life. That was the first moment I nearly answered him, not because I wanted credit, but because I had never asked to own anything of his. The words stayed behind my teeth. If I started listing bus fares, dentist bills, missed opportunities, and nights spent waiting for him to come home, I would turn love into evidence before a room of strangers. I could not do that there. So I looked at Camille instead. Her hand was still resting on Evan's old note. I told her the album had been meant for both of them. I was sorry she had received it this way. Then I picked up my purse. Evan seemed startled that I was leaving. Maybe he had expected a fight once I stood up. Maybe part of him had needed one. If I screamed, accused, or demanded gratitude, he could point to every ugly moment and say, "See, this is what I meant." I gave him nothing like that. The doors closed behind me, cutting off the warm lights and muted music. Outside, the May air felt colder than it had when I arrived. I made it halfway across the parking lot before my hands began to shake. I stopped beside my car and pressed the key against my palm until the metal hurt. For 19 years, I had thought the hardest thing I had ever done for Evan was raising him after our mother died. I was beginning to understand that the harder thing might be accepting who he had become afterward. The reception doors opened behind me. I knew his footsteps before he reached me. Evan had always walked quickly when he was angry, shoulders forward, as though the argument was somewhere ahead of him, and he needed to catch it before it escaped. He accused me of planning the entire scene. In his version, I had waited for his wedding because I knew the album would make him look ungrateful in front of Camille's family. He said I had always needed people to see me as the one who sacrificed, and him as the person who owed something. I let most of it pass without answering. The strange thing was that his anger made certain details clearer. He was not upset because the album lied. He was upset because it remembered. When he finally mentioned money, his voice sharpened. He said I had no right to pretend he had abandoned me after everything he had done to support me over the last few years. That sentence landed differently from the others. The cold in my hands disappeared. I looked at him more carefully. He had said the same thing inside. His friends had said it. Camille had apparently heard it often enough that no one had treated the idea as surprising. Support. Evan had been sending me $300 each month. That much was true. What he had apparently never told any of them was why. I did not correct him in the parking lot. Not yet. I only watched my brother stand beneath the glow, spilling from the reception doors, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than our first month's rent after Mom died, and realized how completely he had reversed the story. Those payments were not charity. They were not help. They were not evidence that Evan Bennett had spent years carrying his unfortunate older sister. They were money he owed me. I drove home from the wedding with Evan's last words circling the inside of my head, but not for the reason he would have wanted. I was not thinking about being called a disgrace. I was thinking about the way he had used the word support, as if repeating it often enough could change what those monthly transfers actually meant. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the reception had become a series of disconnected images. Camille's hand resting on Evan's old graduation note, Margaret's face going still, Nolan lowering his eyes, the silver ribbon left behind on a table where I had expected my brother to open a gift with his wife. I sat in my car long after the engine went quiet. The porch light washed the windshield in a weak yellow glow, and for the first time that night there was no one around me whose comfort I had to consider. I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I placed my phone face down on the kitchen counter because the screen kept lighting up. I assumed Evan was calling. He wasn't. By morning, there were two messages from people whose names I recognized only: Mioe, OE dash OE dash A OE dash OEOEOEOSN. They had found my social media account through photographs and tags from the reception. Neither message was openly vicious. That almost made them worse. One woman suggested I give Evan and Camille some space after such an emotional night. A man from Nolan's table wrote that family resentments were complicated, but a wedding probably had not been the right place to bring them up. I read both messages twice. They wrote as though I had arrived carrying a grievance instead of an album, as though I had taken the microphone, as though Evan's words had been a reaction to something everyone already understood about me. I set the phone down beside my coffee and stared at the dark surface until the steam disappeared. Strangers did not invent the same explanation independently. Someone had given them the shape of the story before I ever walked into that reception hall. On the bookshelf across from my kitchen table sat a photograph I had almost included in the album and then decided against. Evan was 12 in it, standing beside our mother on the narrow front steps of the duplex where we had lived in 2007. He was trying to smile. Mom was wearing a scarf over hair that had thinned from treatment, one hand resting against his shoulder, as if she could keep him steady simply by touching him. I picked up the frame. People like to compress difficult years into clean sentences. Our mother died. Our father was gone. I raised my brother. Each was true, but none contained the fear of being 23 and realizing that a 12-year-old boy's stability depended on me. Our parents had separated years earlier. Mom had sole custody, while Robert had become little more than an address on old paperwork. After she died, I petitioned for guardianship. He was legally notified and did not contest it, and the court appointed me Evan's guardian. I remembered the relief more clearly than the procedure. The day I knew he could stay with me, I came home carrying a folder I was afraid to bend. Evan was at the kitchen table doing math homework. He looked up, saw my face, and understood something had changed before I said anything. I did not tell him how frightened I had been that a judge might decide 23 was too young, or that my income was too thin, or that the life I could offer him was too small. I told him only what I thought a 12-year-old needed to know. He was staying home. That was how I had handled almost everything afterward. I gave Evan the result and hid the cost. By late morning, my phone lit again. This time it was Camille. Her message was short and careful. She asked whether we could talk when I was ready. There was no accusation in it, and no attempt to defend Evan. I stared at her name longer than I should have. My first instinct was still the old one: protect him. Whatever had happened at the wedding, Camille had married him only hours earlier. I did not want to become the person who spent the morning after their wedding handing her a list of reasons to regret it. But ignoring her would have meant leaving Evan's version uncontested again. We exchanged a few messages instead of calling. Camille did not ask for every detail. She asked one question that told me what had been bothering her since the reception. If I had always depended on Evan, why had he once written that everything he became started with me? The photograph in my hand suddenly felt heavier, because for a while I was the adult he had. I almost deleted the sentence before sending it. It sounded too bare for 19 years of history, but anything longer felt like testimony. Camille took several minutes to respond. When she did, the question moved to money. Had Evan really been helping me financially for the last few years? I could picture the story she had been given: Evan making regular transfers, Evan worrying about his difficult older sister, Evan setting boundaries while I resented him for becoming successful. Each piece probably sounded reasonable when arranged carefully enough. My thumb hovered above the screen. Not the way he told you. That was all I sent. I could have explained more. The message thread and the history were both there. But turning a family's financial history into a handful of texts the morning after a wedding felt wrong. Money was easy to total, and sacrifice was easy to distort once you attached numbers to it. Camille did not push. She said she understood, and that we could speak another time. Her restraint unsettled me more than an argument would have. For the rest of the morning, I moved through my house, doing small things that did not need doing. I washed the same coffee mug twice. I folded a dish towel and unfolded it because the corners were uneven. I returned the photograph of Mom and Evan to the shelf, then turned it slightly so I would not have to see his 12-year-old face every time I crossed the room. My phone rang shortly after noon. Evan. I let it ring until the last second before answering. He began with the wedding, but not with an apology. He accused me of using Camille's uncertainty to reopen things that should have stayed private. He said I had always known how much he hated having our childhood dragged into the present, and that contacting his wife now was crossing a line. I reminded him that Camille had contacted me. The silence that followed was brief, but it told me he had not known that. His tone changed after that. Less accusation, more control. He told me there were parts of our family history Camille did not understand and did not need to understand. He called them old family business, as though the years I had spent raising him were embarrassing records that should have remained sealed. I stood at the kitchen counter, looking at the phone light reflected in the window. The brother I remembered used to hate closed doors. The man on the phone was trying to build one between me and the truth. I did not argue about the album. I did not defend the messages I had sent Camille. I asked only why so many people at his wedding believed he had been supporting me. His breathing changed. That was enough. He said people knew he had been sending me money because he had been sending me money. He made the sentence sound obvious, almost impatient, as if the existence of a bank transfer settled its meaning. Then he warned me not to start rewriting the past, just because the wedding had not gone the way I wanted. I gripped the edge of the counter until the pressure steadied my hand. For 19 years I had worried that talking about what I had done for Evan would make him feel indebted. Now he was using that silence to make me look indebted to him. Before ending the call, his voice went flat. If you start telling people your version, I'll tell them why I've been sending you money. The line went dead before I answered. I stood alone in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing, and wondered what version of those payments my brother thought could frighten me more than the truth. Evan's warning stayed with me long after the call ended, not because it frightened me, but because of how certain he sounded that money could be used to rewrite memory. I left my phone on the kitchen counter and went upstairs to the closet at the end of the hall, where I kept a small cardboard box I had moved from apartment to apartment for 19 years. It held almost nothing anyone else would consider valuable: my mother's watch with the broken clasp, 2 birthday cards, a recipe written on the back of an electric bill, and a folded scarf that had long since lost the faint trace of her perfume. I had not opened the box in months. That afternoon I sat on the floor with it between my knees, because there was one memory I needed to stop avoiding. Near the end of Mom's illness, she worried less about dying than about what would happen after she did. She knew Robert would not suddenly become the father Evan needed simply because a funeral had taken place. She also knew me too well. I was 23, already rearranging my work schedule around hospital visits and Evan's school days, already talking as if the future had been decided before anyone asked whether I was ready for it. One evening, when the room smelled of antiseptic and the lotion nurses used on her hands, she made me sit close enough that she did not have to raise her voice. What frightened her was not that I would abandon Evan, it was the opposite. She was afraid I would disappear into taking care of him. She told me he could never be allowed to think he had ruined my life. I remember looking at the hollow beneath her cheekbone and thinking she was worrying about the wrong person. I promised he would never feel like a burden. For years I treated that promise as if it required more than kindness. I thought it required silence. After I became Evan's guardian, I stopped registering for the classes that would have finished my degree, always telling myself I would return when he was settled. We took a cheaper apartment because it kept him in the school district he knew. The heating rattled, the cabinets never shut properly, and I learned to absorb the extra costs of braces, school fees, and ordinary emergencies without making them sound like sacrifices. During his final year of high school, I turned down a better paying position because the move would have forced him into a new school. I never told him there had been a choice. I did not regret those decisions. Evan had been a child, and children were supposed to need things. I had chosen to provide them. The money he owed me came much later. By 2018, Evan was 23, no longer the boy whose permission slips I signed or whose dentist appointments I scheduled. He had finished college and landed the beginning of the kind of career he had worked toward for years, but getting from graduation into that first serious position required more money than he had. There were remaining education costs, the move, deposits, and the ordinary expenses that arrive all at once when someone is trying to start an adult life before the first dependable paycheck catches up. By then, I had spent years rebuilding savings, one careful deposit at a time. My life was modest, but it was stable. I worked full-time at the county library, coordinated youth programs, drove a car I had already paid off, and had learned how to make security out of small numbers repeated consistently. Evan asked me for $25,600. He hated asking. That was one detail I could still remember without needing a photograph. He sat at my kitchen table with his shoulders curved forward and kept turning his coffee cup by the handle without drinking from it. Adult pride had already begun replacing the openness he had possessed as a boy. He explained what he needed, what he expected to earn, and how he planned to pay me back once he had built some stability. I never charged him interest. I never asked him to sign something that would make the loan feel colder than it needed to. I transferred the money because I believed him. More importantly, I believed in him. For several years afterward, I did not press. His career was growing. Mine was steady. When he occasionally mentioned the debt, I told him to get established first. I thought that was another form of keeping my promise to Mom. Let him build his life without carrying the humiliation of always owing his sister. Sitting on the closet floor in 2026, I finally saw the irony. I had worked so hard to protect him from feeling indebted that he had learned to use the debt as evidence of his generosity. 2 days later, Camille and I met in a quiet cafe on the north side of Columbus. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, not because privacy required strategy, but because I wanted enough space around us that neither of us would feel trapped. My hands were wrapped around a mug by the time she arrived, though I had barely touched the coffee. She looked different without the wedding around her. No flowers, no music, no people waiting for photographs. The ring was still on her hand. That was the first thing I noticed, and I hated myself a little for noticing it. Camille did not come armed with accusations. She spoke carefully, pausing before the parts she knew might hurt. Over the years, Evan had described me as someone who made bad choices and then resented him for doing better. According to the story she knew, he had escaped a difficult family situation, built himself from nothing, and still sent money to an older sister who struggled to manage her own life. When he tried to create boundaries, I supposedly reminded him that I had helped raise him and used the past to keep him guilty. Hearing it all at once felt stranger than the insult at the wedding because the story was recognizable. Evan had not invented another childhood. He had taken real pieces, our unstable family, the years I raised him, the money that moved between us and reversed who carried whom. Camille watched my face while she spoke. I could see she was waiting for anger, perhaps because anger was what Evan had taught her to expect from me. Instead, I looked out through the window at cars moving through the afternoon traffic and tried to decide how much truth I could say without turning my life into an invoice. I told her that Evan had worked hard. That part was true. I told her he deserved credit for what he had built. That was also true. Then Camille mentioned the monthly transfers. Something inside me went very still. There are facts that feel different once another person says them aloud. Until that moment, the payments had existed privately between Evan and me, small deposits appearing every month with no ceremony. I had never imagined him pointing to them as proof that I needed him. I set my mug down. Those payments are repayments. Camille did not immediately respond. Her fingers stopped against the paper sleeve around her cup. When she finally asked what he was repaying, the answer lodged in my throat, not because I had forgotten the number. Because once I began explaining the loan, I knew the rest of the story would become harder to keep folded away. For 19 years, I had refused to put love on a ledger. Evan had done it for me. I took out my phone and opened the message thread that had followed us across upgrades, new devices, era, promotions, and years of increasingly short conversations. I scrolled past ordinary fragments until the dates reached the period when he had first begun talking seriously about paying me back. Camille waited. I found the exchange I had been looking for. Evan's own words were still there. I turned the phone toward her. Camille leaned back toward the phone without touching it. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The message on the screen was almost embarrassingly ordinary for something that had just changed the shape of her marriage. It was from April. Evan had written, "After this month, I still owe you $18,400. I know. No accusation, no family drama, no explanation that could be twisted into misunderstanding. Just a number he recognized as his debt." I scrolled backward far enough to show Camille where the repayment arrangement had begun. In May 2024, Evan had proposed sending $300 a month until he was able to increase it. He had borrowed $25,600 from me in 2018. 24 monthly payments came to $7,200. Subtract that from the original loan, and the balance was exactly what his recent message said it was: $18,400. I did not pull out bank statements or calculate interest because there was no interest. There was nothing complicated about it. For nearly 2 years, $300 had arrived every month from my brother, and I had treated each deposit as what it was: a small piece of money returning to the person who had lent it. Camille had been told something entirely different. She sat very still, one hand resting beside her untouched coffee. The wedding ring caught the afternoon light whenever her fingers moved. I watched her reread the message, then scroll back to the beginning of the repayment discussion as though the answer might somehow change if she looked long enough. What hurt her was not the amount. I could see that before she said anything. Evan had not hidden a secret fortune or an impossible debt. He had taken a simple financial arrangement and reversed the roles inside it. Every time Camille had seen him send me $300, he had allowed her to believe she was watching generosity. Every time he complained about how difficult it was to set boundaries with family, the transfer made his story look more convincing. The truth was almost painfully plain. He owed me money, and he had turned repayment into charity. I expected anger from Camille. Instead, her face seemed to empty. She looked less like a furious bride than someone who had just discovered that a familiar room had been built a few inches crooked. She told me, in a few careful sentences, that Evan had referenced those payments many times. Never dramatically. That was part of why she had believed him. He had described them as an obligation he felt toward me, because I struggled. He had made himself sound reluctant to discuss it, as if his privacy proved his decency. I listened without interrupting. The more she explained, the more I understood how deliberate the construction had been. Evan had learned something important about lying. The strongest lies rarely announce themselves. They sit quietly beside real facts and let people draw the wrong conclusion. He did send me money. I had helped raise him. Our family history had been difficult. All he had changed was the direction of the debt. Camille asked whether I wanted the money repaid immediately. That question startled me, because I had not come there to collect anything. I told her no. The repayment schedule was not the problem. Evan could keep sending the agreed amount. He could take longer if life required it. I had never measured our relationship by how quickly the balance reached zero. What mattered was that he had used the balance to create a version of me that made his own success look cleaner. I left the cafe with no sense of victory. The afternoon had brightened while we were inside, and sunlight reflected harshly off the parked cars. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the same message thread still open on my phone. For years, I had thought that keeping records of a family loan was practical. Now those ordinary messages had become the first thing capable of resisting Evan's story without requiring me to make a speech. That should have relieved me. Instead, it frightened me. Because if Evan had been willing to lie about something this easy to verify, I had no idea how much of our history he had already rearranged elsewhere. After we met, Camille told Evan directly that she had seen the repayment message and asked why he had presented money he owed me as support. I learned later that he did not answer cleanly. What mattered in that moment was what he did next. Instead of containing the contradiction between himself and his wife, he pushed his version outward. Within days, the story began moving beyond their marriage. Margaret heard from Evan before she heard from me. Several friends did too. He told them the wedding had reopened old family resentment and that I was furious because he had finally decided to establish financial boundaries. He said I had spent years exaggerating my role in raising him, and that now I was trying to damage his marriage by making ordinary support payments look like a debt. I learned pieces of this indirectly. Margaret contacted me with careful questions instead of accusations. One of Camille's friends sent a restrained message suggesting that newlyweds deserved room to work through private issues without outside pressure. The language was different from the wedding messages. The pattern was not. Evan was getting ahead of the truth. Again. I began noticing how little effort it took for him to do it. He did not need everyone to believe a complicated lie. He only needed them uncertain enough about me that anything I said would look self-serving. That realization changed something I had been resisting since the reception. Until then, silence had felt like restraint. Now it was becoming cooperation. Evan called me near the end of the third week after the wedding. I was still at the library when his name appeared on my screen, so I waited until I was outside before answering. Evening light stretched across the parking lot, and I stood beside my car with one hand resting on the roof while he spoke. His anger had hardened into something colder. He accused me of turning Camille against him and said Margaret was now asking questions that had no business being asked. He told me I was taking one old loan and using it to rewrite years of generosity. He insisted that if I kept speaking to Camille, he would stop letting me control the narrative. Then he said the sentence that ended whatever protection I had still been trying to give him. If you keep talking to her, I'll make sure everyone knows what you're really like. I looked through the windshield at the empty passenger seat. For most of my adult life, I had been afraid of making Evan feel exposed. I had swallowed corrections, softened memories, and left entire pieces of my own history unspoken because I believed love should not embarrass someone for once needing you. But Evan was no longer asking for dignity. He was asking me to surrender mine. The difference was finally impossible to ignore. I did not threaten him back or promise to expose him. I made a smaller decision. From that moment forward, if someone asked me a direct question, I would answer truthfully. I would no longer protect a lie. The next afternoon, Camille showed Margaret the message thread herself. I knew because Margaret contacted me afterward. Her message contained only one real question. If I was the dependent sister Evan had been supporting for years, why did his own messages show that he was the one who still owed me money? Margaret's question sat on my phone for several minutes before I answered it. There was no accusation in the wording, only a contradiction she could no longer ignore. If I had spent years depending on Evan, why did his own message show that he still owed me $18,400? I could have sent her everything. Instead, I gave her the smallest truthful version. I confirmed only what Camille had already shown her. The 2018 loan, the repayment arrangement Evan had proposed, and the balance in his own message. I left childhood sacrifices out of it. Margaret had asked about the debt, and the debt was enough. Margaret called later that afternoon. She was measured, almost formal, but the careful distance I had felt from her at the wedding was different now. She wanted context, not ammunition. I told her the loan had been interest-free, that Evan had proposed the repayment schedule himself, and that I had never asked Camille or anyone in the Hayes family to intervene. Then she asked whether I expected anything from them now. I looked around my kitchen at the same chipped table where Evan had once asked for the money. No, one word was enough. I did not want Margaret's connections. I did not want Camille to repay me on Evan's behalf. I did not want wedding guests forming a jury around our family. I wanted only to stop being described as someone I had never been. After the call, I understood why Margaret's reaction mattered. She had spent years hearing about a difficult sister who supposedly created problems Evan had to manage. Yet the woman on the phone was not asking her to solve anything. That did not prove I was right about everything. But it made Evan's version harder to hold together. Camille later told me what happened when she pressed Evan for an answer without letting him turn the question into a judgment of my personality. He could not seem to stay with one answer. First, he minimized the loan, saying it had never really been a formal debt between us. Then he suggested I was presenting an incomplete picture because he had helped me in other ways. When Camille returned to the written balance, he argued that I had received more money than I admitted. When she pointed out that his own message still acknowledged $18,400 outstanding, he shifted again and said the amount was beside the point. By then, the explanation was changing faster than the question. Camille told me that was what frightened her most. Not that Evan had once borrowed money, not even that he had lied about it. It was the ease with which each explanation was discarded the moment it stopped working. I listened from my living room with my phone against my ear, watching evening light move slowly across the floorboards. I did not tell Camille what decision she should make. I had already spent too much of my life deciding what would be best for Evan. After we ended the call, one old image returned. Evan at 15, leaving an envelope of birthday money on the kitchen counter after seeing me calculate expenses the night before. It was less than $100, and I gave it back, but I had never forgotten the impulse behind it. He had once noticed when I was carrying too much and wanted to help. Remembering that did not excuse the man he had become. It made his adult choices harder to dismiss as something he had always been. Near the end of the 4th week after the wedding, another name appeared on my phone, Nolan Pierce. I stared at it before opening the message. Until then, Nolan was mostly the man whose laugh I had heard seconds after Evan called me a burden. His message did not begin with excuses. He apologized for laughing. He said he had spent days replaying the reception and trying to understand why he had reacted that way before he even knew what was happening. The answer, he admitted, was uncomfortable. By the time I arrived at the wedding, Evan had already taught him what kind of person to expect. That sentence made me sit down. Nolan explained that the jokes about me had existed for years. Nothing elaborate. Evan occasionally complained about the sister he still had to help, the family guilt he could never escape, the money he kept sending even after trying to establish boundaries. Nolan and the others had accepted the story because they had no reason to think it was false. Then he mentioned something I had never heard about before, a private group chat. It was the ordinary kind friends used for wedding logistics, jokes, plans, and whatever else accumulated over years. Nolan said Evan had talked about me there too. Before the wedding, he had specifically warned them that I might bring up how I had raised him or make an issue out of money. I felt the room narrow around me. The warning itself was not proof of anything beyond what Evan had already been doing, framing me before I could speak. But Nolan said, reading those old messages now, after seeing the album and learning the truth about the payments, made them look entirely different. He did not send screenshots immediately. I was glad he didn't. I did not want the next truth to arrive, because I had demanded that someone search for it. Nolan told me he had gone back through the thread because he was trying to understand his own behavior at the reception. He had laughed because Evan's words had landed inside a story Nolan already believed. The cruelest part was how normal that belief had felt until the album forced him to look at it from another direction. I told him that if he had something he believed I needed to see, the choice to send it had to be his. Then I put the phone down. For most of that evening, nothing came. I made dinner, washed the plate, prepared notes for the next day's youth program at the library. Ordinary motions steadied me in ways conversations no longer could. At 9:17, the screen lit again. Nolan had not sent the screenshots yet. He sent one sentence first. There's one message I can't stop thinking about. I read it twice. Until then, I had known Evan lied about the past. For the first time, I began to wonder how long before the wedding he had been preparing other people not to believe me. Nolan sent the screenshots 12 minutes after that message. I was still at my kitchen table when they arrived. The room had gone quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing outside. I had not turned on the television. I had not even moved the plate I had washed earlier. My phone lay beside a stack of library notes, bright enough to cast a pale rectangle across the wood. There were only 3 screenshots. That was enough. The first message had been sent weeks before the wedding. Evan was responding to a joke about family speeches when he wrote that I sometimes liked to play the I raised you card, whenever I thought he was forgetting where he came from. He added that if I ever started talking about the years after Mom died, people should understand that I had a habit of turning ordinary family responsibility into a lifelong debt. I read the sentence once, then again. For almost 2 decades, I had avoided saying those exact things because I did not want Evan to feel that I owned part of his life. I had kept quiet about forms, school meetings, money, missed opportunities, and the years when every decision I made had to include a 12-year-old boy who had already lost too much. He had taken that silence and built a warning around the truth I refused to use against him. The second screenshot was about money. Evan had told the group that if I ever complained about what he sent me, it was because he was trying to establish financial boundaries, and I could not accept losing his support. There was a laughing reaction beneath the message, and a few short replies I did not bother reading closely. I did not need them. The meaning was already clear. By then, the $300 transfers had been arriving for nearly 2 years. Evan knew why they existed. He knew the original loan. He knew the balance. He had written the number himself, and before anyone at the wedding ever heard me say, "Those payments were never support," he had already told them what that sentence was supposed to mean. Not truth, manipulation. The third screenshot was the one Nolan had not been able to forget. It had been sent shortly before the wedding. Evan wrote that he wanted Camille's family to understand who the problem is before Laura starts telling her version. I held the phone in both hands. There was no script for the microphone, and no message telling Nolan to laugh. But Evan had done something deliberate enough. He had anticipated the truths I might mention and taught people to distrust them before I ever spoke. The laughter at the wedding suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. Nolan and the others had not laughed because they had independently decided I was ridiculous. They had been given a frame long before I entered the room. When Evan pointed at me and called me a burden, his friends were reacting to a character they thought they already knew. I was not sure which hurt more, the insult itself, or realizing he had spent time teaching strangers how to hear it. I put the phone down. My hands had started shaking again, but this time there was no parking lot, no reception hall, no one watching me. I stayed at the table until the shaking passed, then carried my mug to the sink even though it was already empty. That was when the memory came. Not the courtroom after Mom died, not the apartment, or the braces, or the money. The funeral. Evan had been 12 and completely exhausted by the time we got home. People had filled the house all afternoon with casseroles, paper plates, soft voices, and promises to call. Then one by one they left. The silence afterward had frightened him more than the crowd. He fell asleep on the couch, still wearing the shirt he had worn to the service. I sat beside him because I did not know what else to do. At some point in the night, I tried to stand. His hand closed around the sleeve of my sweater without his eyes opening. He held on. That was all. No speech, no request. Just a 12-year-old boy asleep with his fist around my sleeve because somewhere beneath exhaustion and grief, he was afraid the last person left might disappear too. I sat back down. For years afterward, that memory had been one of the reasons I never let Evan feel ashamed of needing me. I had known what it cost him to depend on someone after our mother died. I wanted him to grow into adulthood without believing that vulnerability made him small. Now, the adult version of that boy had taught people to treat the fact that I stayed as evidence that I was controlling him. The grief came quietly. I did not cry the way I had after Mom died. There was no dramatic collapse. I sat on the edge of the couch where Evan had once slept and pressed my palms against my knees until I could breathe normally again. Nolan sent another message later that night. He said he was willing to tell the rest of the group what he now understood and correct the things he had repeated about me. I told Nolan that if he wanted to correct his own part in what happened, he should. He had repeated Evan's story and laughed, taking responsibility for that belonged to him. I would not circulate the screenshots or turn them into a campaign. The truth was already ugly enough without becoming entertainment. Nolan respected that. He also told me he intended to send the screenshots to Camille. I did not stop him. Those messages were not simply about me. Evan had used them to shape what his future wife believed before she could hear another version. Camille had a right to know the information surrounding her marriage had been managed long before the wedding night. The following afternoon, I went to work. Children from the summer program left fingerprints on tables and returned books to the wrong shelves. One boy spent 15 minutes choosing between two dinosaur books and finally checked out both. The ordinariness steadied me. Life had not stopped because mine had shifted. Late that evening, Camille contacted me. She did not give me details I had not asked for. She told me Nolan had sent her the screenshots. She had read them. She had confronted Evan with what they showed, not a planned wedding speech, but a deliberate effort to make everyone distrust anything I might later say. Evan had argued that he had only been preparing friends for predictable family drama. Camille no longer believed that explanation. She told me she had left the home they shared and was staying with Margaret while she decided what came next. I stared at that message longer than any of the others. I had not wanted her marriage to fail. That was something Evan would probably never believe. I had wanted him to tell the truth before truth became expensive. But every time he had been given that chance, he had chosen control instead. The next call came after midnight. Evan's name lit the screen in the dark beside my bed. I knew before answering that he had learned Camille was gone. His voice was low, stripped of the performance he had used at the wedding. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the screenshots, no recognition of what Camille must have felt reading them, only blame. You finally got what you wanted. You finally got what you wanted. For a moment, I said nothing. Camille had left. Nolan had sent the screenshots, and Margaret was asking questions Evan could no longer redirect toward me. In his mind, all of it had become something I had done. A month earlier, I would have rushed to separate my actions from his consequences. This time I told him only that Camille had made her own choices. He spent the rest of the call blaming me for making the truth impossible to contain. I let the accusation end without defending myself. For the first time, I understood that the normal Evan wanted back was simply the version of events in which everyone stayed quiet enough for his story to survive. Camille contacted me 2 days later. By then she had been staying with Margaret long enough for the shock of leaving to settle into something more deliberate. She asked to meet, and we returned to the same cafe where I had first shown her the repayment messages. The wedding ring was still on her hand. I noticed it, then forced my eyes toward the window. Camille did not come to ask whether Evan had ever loved her. She did not ask me to explain every year of his childhood or diagnose how he became the man she had married. She had already spent enough time trying to make his contradictions fit together. What she told me was much simpler. Camille could have accepted the poverty, the guardianship, and the fact that Evan had borrowed money from me as a young adult. None of that embarrassed her. What she could not accept was what he had done with those facts afterward. He had reversed the debt, degraded the person who had helped him, and attacked harder each time the contradictions surfaced. Camille remained separated and had begun the process of ending the marriage. The legal part would take time, but the decision underneath it no longer felt temporary. She did not trust the man she had married. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. The phrase felt inadequate, but it was true. I had not wanted her marriage to become collateral damage in a fight over my own name. Camille shook her head before I could say much. She did not absolve me, because there was nothing she believed I had done that required absolution. That almost hurt more. When we parted, she walked toward her car without looking back. I stayed at the table for another 10 minutes, watching condensation slide down my water glass and thinking about how easily one person's refusal to tell the truth could force everyone around him to make decisions they never wanted. Margaret called me later that week. She did not discuss Camille's private decisions beyond what Camille had already told me. Instead, she wanted me to hear one thing directly from her rather than through gossip. Before the wedding, Margaret and several professional contacts had planned to make introductions for Evan and Camille's workplace design consultancy. Those doors had depended on trust, and Margaret no longer intended to put her name behind them. She was not threatening his existing career. She was simply withdrawing help that had never been guaranteed. For a man so invested in calling himself self-made, the consequence was painfully precise. A few days after that, Nolan sent me another message. He had told the friend group what the screenshots meant and admitted that he had repeated Evan's version of me without ever questioning it. He did not present himself as heroic. He included the fact that he had laughed at the reception before he understood what was happening. A few apologies reached me afterward. Some were clumsy, some were sincere. A couple of people said nothing at all. I did not answer every message. There had been a time when I thought vindication would feel like a room turning toward me and finally admitting I had been right. In reality, it was quieter and much less satisfying. An apology from a stranger could not restore 19 years. Nolan's guilt could not erase the sound of laughter after Evan called me a burden. And none of it gave me back my brother. That was the loss I had resisted naming. Evidence could correct a lie, but it could not restore the brother attached to my old memories. I had been waiting for him without admitting it, believing that enough truth might force Evan to recognize himself. Instead, each truth became another enemy he needed to blame. That realization settled slowly over the next several days. It appeared in small absences. I stopped checking my phone every morning for an apology. I stopped composing explanations in the shower. I stopped imagining the conversation where Evan finally understood exactly why the word burden had hurt so much. There was relief in those omissions. There was grief, too. Loving someone does not guarantee that you will recognize the person they become. Sometimes the cruelest part is remembering clearly who they once were. By late June, nearly 6 weeks had passed since the wedding. One Saturday afternoon, I was at my kitchen table sorting papers from the library when someone knocked on the front door. Not the doorbell. 3 firm knocks. I knew the rhythm before I stood. Through the narrow glass beside the door, I saw Evan on my porch. He was alone. I did not open the door immediately. For 19 years, Evan had never needed to knock 3 times at my house. He had once had a key. Later, after he moved away and built a life that seemed to require less and less of me, he still came inside with the easy entitlement of someone who had spent half his childhood there. Even after the wedding, some part of my body remembered him that way. But the man standing on the porch in late June was not the boy who used to leave his backpack beside my kitchen table. Through the narrow pane of glass, I watched him shift his weight and glance toward the street. He looked tired, not ruined, not broken. His suit from the wedding had been replaced by an open-collared shirt and dark pants, and there was no audience behind him waiting to approve whatever version of the story he told next. That mattered. At the wedding, Evan had possessed the microphone, the laughter, the room, and the certainty that everyone already knew who I was. On my porch, he had only himself. I opened the door but did not step aside. The smallest flicker crossed his face when he realized I was not automatically inviting him in. He started talking before I had to ask why he was there. Over the next several minutes, he gave me a version of the last 6 weeks that sounded painfully familiar. He admitted that the wedding speech had gone too far, but even that admission came wrapped in distance. He should not have said things that way. Nolan had made private messages into something bigger than they were. Camille had allowed other people to interfere in a marriage that should have been handled between husband and wife. Margaret had overreacted by pulling away from the business plans. And I, apparently, could have stopped all of it. The strange thing was how calm I felt listening. Weeks earlier, I might have interrupted each sentence. I would have reminded him that Nolan had only shown messages Evan himself had written. I would have pointed out that Camille was not an outsider to her own marriage. I would have explained that Margaret had never promised him clients, only introductions based on trust. Instead, I stood with one hand resting against the edge of the door and let him keep going. I was listening for one thing, accountability. not humiliation, not surrender, not an apology dramatic enough to erase what happened. Just one moment when Evan would speak about his choices without immediately placing someone else beside them to absorb the blame. It never came. He said I could have protected him. That sentence almost made me laugh, but there was nothing funny in it. Protecting Evan had shaped most of my adult life, even after he called me a burden in front of strangers. My first instinct had been to walk away. Now he was accusing me of failing because, for once, I had stopped protecting him from the consequences of the truth. I studied his face while he spoke. There were still familiar details there. The small line that appeared beside his mouth when he was frustrated. The way he rubbed his thumb against the side of his index finger when he wanted to control his temper. I had seen those habits at 12, at 17, at 23. For years, those similarities had made it easy to believe that the old Evan was still underneath everything else, waiting to return. I no longer trusted that hope. When he finally paused, I told him what I had not been able to say at the wedding. The worst part had never been the money or a lack of gratitude. I had never wanted Evan to spend his life thanking me for raising him. The betrayal was simpler. He knew the truth and had taught other people how to dismiss it before I spoke. You knew, I said, and you made sure they wouldn't believe me. It was one of the few sentences I needed to say aloud. Evan looked away toward the yard. For a second, I thought I had finally reached the part of him that could still recognize what he had done. Then he told me I had always wanted him to feel indebted. The accusation entered the space between us so quietly that it took a moment to understand what he was really saying. All those years, he claimed, I had kept the story of raising him alive because I needed to be important. The loan was part of the same pattern. The album was part of it. Even my silence, somehow, became proof that I had been waiting for the right moment to collect. I felt something inside me loosen. Not anger, a knot. I had spent 19 years terrified of exactly that accusation. Mom's voice came back to me from a hospital room in 2007. Her fear that Evan would grow up believing he had ruined my future, my promise that he would never feel like a burden. I had kept it so completely that I had never allowed myself to speak honestly about the weight I carried. And still, here he was, claiming I had spent his entire life making him feel guilty. That was when I finally understood there had been no perfect version of my love that could have prevented this. I could not control what meaning Evan assigned to being helped. I could only control whether I kept letting that meaning erase me. I thought of the 12-year-old who had once slept gripping my sleeve after our mother's funeral. That child had not been a burden. He had been grieving and needed someone to stay. The adult man on my porch needed something different, accountability, and I could not provide it by carrying the consequence for him. Evan's anger sharpened when he realized I was not going to argue. He asked what he was supposed to do now. Camille was gone. Margaret wanted nothing to do with his business plans. Nolan had turned friends against him. His name, his marriage, his future, all of it, in his telling, had been damaged because I had refused to keep one family matter private. For the first time, I heard the question beneath the accusation. What are you going to do to fix this for me? It was the same shape as 100 questions from years ago, only the stakes had changed. At 12, Evan had needed me to sign forms, make dinner, keep the lights on, tell him where he would sleep. At 31, he was asking me to repair consequences created by his own decisions. I could not do that, and still call it love. I already raised you once, Evan. His face changed. I did not add a speech. There was nothing else the sentence needed. I would not repair his marriage, restore his friendships, or teach a 31-year-old man how to apologize. For years, I had confused helping Evan with preventing him from feeling the full weight of a consequence. That ended on my porch. I closed the door gently. No slam, no final insult. Through the glass, I watched him stand there for several seconds before turning toward his car. When he drove away, the house became quiet again. I remained by the door longer than I needed to, one hand still resting against the lock. I expected guilt to arrive. It had accompanied almost every boundary I had ever tried to set with him. This time it did not. What I felt was grief, but beneath it was something unfamiliar enough that I had to stand still and let it take shape. Space. For 19 years, nearly every major decision in my life had carried the same question somewhere inside it. What does Evan need? I walked back to the kitchen table where my library papers were still spread beneath the afternoon light. For the first time since I was 23, another question came before it. What did I want? By September, the house had changed in ways no one else would have noticed. Nothing dramatic. The same curtains hung in the kitchen. The same stack of library mail collected near the door. My mother's old watch still sat in its box upstairs with the broken clasp. Evan's car no longer appeared in my driveway, but even that absence had stopped feeling like an event. The biggest change was what I no longer did. I no longer checked my phone every morning, expecting either an apology or another accusation. I no longer rehearsed explanations while washing dishes. I no longer opened the old message thread to remind myself that the numbers were real, and I had not imagined the way he reversed them. Silence had stopped feeling like suspense. It had become ordinary. Camille and I stayed in occasional contact without trying to turn shared damage into instant friendship. She remained separated from Evan, and the legal process of ending the marriage was underway. Margaret's planned professional introductions remained withdrawn, while Evan kept his existing job and ordinary adult life. Nolan told me several friendships had cooled after he corrected the record. There was no dramatic moment when the world turned against my brother. His consequences were quieter: a marriage ending, a business plan stalled, trust no longer loaned to him on someone else's name. Sometimes consequence was simply the absence of rescue. That realization followed me into the library one Tuesday morning, when I found myself standing beside a bulletin board covered with continuing education brochures. I had passed that board hundreds of times. Degree completion programs, certifications, evening coursework, part-time tracks for adults returning after long gaps. I had never really stopped seeing them. I had simply stopped imagining they belonged to me. At 23, I had told myself I would return to school when Evan was stable. At 28, I told myself work was too busy. At 33, the idea felt embarrassing. By 40, I had turned the unfinished degree into part of the architecture of my life, like an unused room everyone eventually stopped asking about. That morning, I pulled one of the brochures free. The paper made a dry little sound against the plastic holder. No music swelled. No one noticed. I carried it back to my desk. Over the next 2 weeks, I looked into a part-time adult degree completion program focused on community education and youth services. The work itself was familiar. I had been coordinating programs for years. I knew how to build reading initiatives, work with families, manage teen volunteers, and create spaces where children who had nowhere else to go could spend an afternoon feeling safe. What I lacked was the credential that would allow me to move into some of the roles I had once imagined before life changed direction. For the first time, I looked at tuition and schedules without measuring them against Evan's needs. No school district, bill, move, or loan had to come before the decision. The only question left was whether I wanted to do it. I did. A week before I submitted the application, Camille contacted me about the album. She still had it. I had not thought about that blue cover since the wedding. For months, the album had existed in my memory as the object that changed the room. Evan's face when he recognized the box. Camille unfolding his graduation note. Nolan lowering his eyes. I had almost forgotten what the album had been before all of that. A gift. Camille asked whether I wanted it back. I said yes. She mailed it rather than arranging another meeting. That felt right. The box arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I left it unopened on the dining table until after dinner. Even then, I stood over it for several minutes before cutting the tape. The silver ribbon was gone. The album itself looked exactly the same. I opened the album to Evan at 13 with braces, the leaning birthday cake, the Christmas tree beside the radiator, the bus pass, the borrowed graduation jacket. Page after page had once been family memory before anyone needed it as evidence. I expected bitterness and found tenderness instead for the boy in those pictures and for the young woman behind the camera. What I had done for Evan had been real. So had my love. His betrayal did not travel backward through time and erase either one. I had spent months afraid that acknowledging sacrifice would make the sacrifice ugly. But there was another mistake hidden inside that fear, believing Evan's reaction had the power to decide what my choices meant. It did not. I had loved a grieving child. I had kept him safe. I had given up things I later wished I had returned to sooner. Those truths could exist together without becoming an invoice. Near the back of the album, I found the graduation note again. Everything I become after today started with you. Once, that sentence would have broken me. I read it now and closed the page. Whatever Evan became after that day belonged to him. The good parts, the ambition, the hard work, the lies, the cruelty, the choices he made when telling the truth threatened the person he wanted everyone else to see. I no longer needed to carry authorship for any of it. That evening, I left the album on the shelf beside my mother's photograph, rather than hiding it in a closet. Then I opened my laptop. The application form was still waiting where I had left it. I filled in the final section, checked the dates one more time, and reached the button at the bottom of the page. For 19 years, the word burden had belonged to my mother's fear, until Evan threw it at me in a wedding reception. He had never been my burden when he was 12. He had been a child who needed someone to stay. The burden I finally put down was the belief that loving him required me to disappear from my own story. I clicked submit. The screen changed to a confirmation page, my reflection faint in the darkened window beyond the table. No applause, no audience, no microphone. That was enough. Love is not a ledger. But love is also not permission for someone else to rewrite what you lived. And for the first time since I was 23, the life in front of me did not begin with the question of what Evan needed. It began with mine.